So my name is Michael Weber. I'm pleased you could be here today. I want to go ahead and invite the first panel up to their seats while I introduce Ernie Moniz and give some administrative comments about the structure of today's conference. First, I'm glad you're here. I think it's important that we have the logos up of Texas and France. It's really sort of France and USA, but we put the Texas flag and Texas up there just to put it to scale. So you see, Texas is about the same size as France, and that's part of our mindset. So that's a realistic fact. But we're glad to have this opportunity. When Doug Bio came to me like a year and a half ago, he said, hey, if I get some money to organize a conference, will you organize it? And I said, sure. I really wasn't thinking about it. Then about 9 months ago, he came to me, he said, well, I got the money, now you have to organize it. And I was like, did I promise to do that? So it's been a fun partnership working with him on that. The structure is, we have 4 panels today, plus a keynote just after lunch. We will feed you. We have 2 breaks during the day with coffee and snacks. You have plenty of salt and carbohydrates and sugar and things like that. Then we'll give you lunch, then we'll have reception. We're trying to bribe your attention all day long for this. In the panels, we each be comprised of a moderator and other speakers. They'll speak for about 10 minutes or so. Then they'll have a Q&A moderated by the moderator. Then they'll have a chance for you to ask questions as well. So we'll have a variety of topics we're going to cover and a variety of chances for you to ask questions, we hope. This will be televised. There are a couple cameras here, so if you are on the run from the law, this is probably a good time for you to leave the room so we don't capture you on TV and expose you, or if you have unpaid parking tickets or anything like that. And in fact, for the speakers here, we have set up video release forms. We want you to sign those so we can post the videos of this. So for each panel and for the keynote, we'll ask you to sign this video release form. And we have a blogger here from Scientific American who will be live blogging. So I guess be careful what you say. That's sort of what I'm trying to say. I like the idea that this is a France and USA and it's taking place in Austin. We have the French legation nearby. A lot of people forget that Texas was actually its own country for about 9 years, from 1836 to 1845, and France recognized Texas as a country and set up basically a diplomatic outpost just up the hill from here. So we have a long diplomatic history with France, and it's good to see that going on today. I want to introduce this first panel about shale gas, the sort of the topic that we closed with in the opening remarks by Bontom. And we have Ernie Moniz here. We're lucky to have him. He's actually going to do double duty as a panelist and a moderator, so he's one of those kind of guys who can do everything. And it's a real honor to have him here. He's one of the smartest people on a lot of these topics with deep technical knowledge in physics, but also a lot of policy knowledge and policy practicing experience from posts as advisors for multiple presidents in the Department of Energy and now PCAST and other scientific positions. So it's great to have him here. And Ernie, I'll let you take it away.
You'll have somebody bringing up all this.
I'll bring up your slides for you.
Next guys as well?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Mike. Before I become a speaker, I would like to address the panel and say that we should try to for 9 minutes rather than 10. I will give an extremely brief introduction, but you may use as much of your 9 minutes to introduce yourself further as you wish, because we do want to leave about a half an hour for discussion. Okay. So with that, I'll switch roles and provide something of a framer, I hope, for our discussion on shale. And the first thing is, you know, we say shale gas in the United States has been a game changer, and I believe that is in fact a correct characterization. One might argue the only real game changer in a very, very long time. It's probably a good idea to remind ourselves why we call it a game changer. Well, for one thing, with purely market dynamics, we've seen, at least to this spring, a shift, for example, in the share of electricity generation, coal falling by about a third, gas coming up to a third to be essentially equal with coal. This is an incredible fast shift in what is normally a very slow-moving energy system, again, accomplished by market forces. And, of course, very strongly tied to the reduction the U.S. has seen in CO2 emissions. Of course, until recently, there were lots of expectations of lower 48 U.S. LNG exports, eventually creating issues potentially similar to that with oil. That's now history. The story is the opposite, contention over whether or not we should export natural gas. Natural gas, and especially natural gas liquids, being produced from shale plays has changed the manufacturing landscape. The estimate is about $90 billion has already been invested in new manufacturing capacity using ethane and other liquids. The geographical distribution, now having supply in the Northeast, has changed flows in the United States and, in fact, brought gas closer to some markets in the Northeast, and in turn, and I can assure you living in Boston, seeing visible reductions in bills, in gas bills, in power bills. And finally, the estimates are always a little bit squishy, but something on the order of 600,000 jobs created is an estimate. I mean, this is really a game changer, and perhaps in contrast to the remarks we just heard from France, in our case, there is no politician, in my view, who is going to walk away from this. Now, we will have issues in terms of various barriers to further extension of this resource. Oops, I'll come back to this. For example, environmental concerns. And so there is still an unresolved question as to how that's going to be managed. But in my view, it will be managed. There are other issues, such as squeezing out other options. Suddenly, gas is not very popular with its energy competitors. A lot of people felt, well, that was fine when it was coal. They don't feel so happy when it is potentially contributing to a lack of enthusiasm about renewables subsidies. And of course, also, nuclear plants are feeling it in an indirect way because the clearing price for electricity has come down, and their cash flows have been seriously impacted. I'll come back to responses to these, but just wanted to go through them. A third issue, which is relevant to this question of the future trajectory, is LNG exports. Will we allow them? If we do allow them, will they, in fact, increase domestic prices substantially and hurt the manufacturing renaissance? And finally, R&D. While there is additional R&D going on now as the major oil companies and service companies enter this with both feet, still I would argue that there are remaining areas of R&D that could be important and are very basic for enhancing production. I want to go back this one slide. It's a little bit complicated, and I won't ask you to go through all of it. It's a scatter plot of U.S. oil and gas prices. And today, if you go out to, say, the order of $100 per barrel on the horizontal axis and look up, what you'll find is that the U.S. price is up there around, let's call it 3 or 350. The European price is somewhere 10 or 11, and the East Asian price is way up around $16 or $17. That's a very important differentiator. We should remember, at least to date, when we talk about the shale gas revolution, it is an American story, and it's an American story mainly because it has driven a low to very modest natural gas price. And that, of course, is the basis of this game-changing element. Now, here, again, I'll just say that quickly, running through these, we can discuss this more. Environmental concerns. There are real issues, water, methane, microseismicity, et cetera. As a rough general statement, I would say all of these are manageable, which should not be confused with managing them. And that's going to be the real challenge. Squeezing out other options, sure, gas is really dominant, but let's say with renewables, I believe we should take a very different point of view, and that is that when it comes to carbon, gas is part of our solution, at least for some time, and we should take advantage of the time to innovate and bring down the cost of renewables. The worst thing is to get time and not use it, and that, I'm afraid, is where we are happening. LNG exports, I'll come back to this in a minute in the context of geopolitics. So let me just say a little bit about global, this panel was also entitled Global Implications. This is a model of what might happen if we had a truly global market down the road, say in 20, 25 years. The point is a market like the oil market in which gas flows depending upon kind of a global base price. And the key would be Russia and the Middle East in this picture in terms of having flows going both east and west to equilibrate a market. However, I want to emphasize that even if this occurs, the U.S. will still have a major advantage because we have the supply very close to a large market, and the supply chain costs for moving this gas over a long distance are $4 or $5 per million BTU. So the U.S. is likely to have a continuing advantage in terms of this real gas gas price at the user. Now that could change potentially if unconventional gas globally were also found to be close to major markets and change these flows. This is a rather crude estimate from the EIA about possible shale resources in various parts of the world. And of course, as we've seen, or as we know, the other two very large markets are Europe and the Far East. In Europe, we see on this map, France, Poland, there are others, varying levels of commitment to producing the shale gas, varying geologies. It's not at all clear that producing the gas is as beneficial as it is here. Very different issues of mineral rights ownership, very important driver as to the incentives, et cetera. So many open questions. In the Far East, China, potentially huge resources, and obviously, again, a potentially major shift in supply and demand. I'll just add here that when it comes to the United States and LNG exports, so far all we talk about is an analysis as to how much would exports drive our production and how much would it drive our prices. But in the real world, there are other issues, geopolitical issues. For example, Japan post-Fukushima, desperate for gas. They have been extremely responsive to American calls for cutting off Iranian oil imports. What do? These are complex decisions with multiple dimensions and therefore unresolved. Finally, I'll just say this is a picture I don't want to spend too much time on. It's from one of our studies showing the U.S. power sector response to carbon policy. And on the one hand, it's pretty obvious. Theoretically, in a virtual economic world, coal gets squeezed out because it's carbon intensive. Gas is initially part of the solution. Then gas later on becomes part of the problem because it's a fossil fuel. And we have to land on the other side of the bridge in a carbon-free world. France is already at the other side of the bridge with nuclear, again highlighting the very, very different situations that we are in. But how shale gas may displace coal globally is a key issue in terms of carbon emissions.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I'm glad I'm going third because it's going to be harder and harder today to offer new content as we go through with the speakers. But
I'm just making it up.
In fact, Paul, you've also overridden my 30 years of experience in the industry, which I thought was a lot, but 40 years is even more impressive. I've been with Total for around 30 years, and that puts me in the energy industry and the petrochemicals industry, and I spent a lot of time in the plastics industry as well. So the plastics industry is one of those many industries that's sort of at the tail end of this revolution, and it's taking great advantage of it as well. So we'll talk about some of those issues. I'll try to concentrate a little more on what effects it has on the petrochemicals industry to keep from being redundant, but just first a general comment, and this is an ACC estimate, but across all heavy energy intensive industries, we're looking at a 7% increase in manufacturing in the US, which is, it's only a single digit, but 7% increase is a fantastic improvement over the outlook in the manufacturing industry up until just a few years ago. It was in decline in the US with no end in sight, and the shale gas and the shale oil revolution has changed that dramatically. So it's a really big story of change in our industry. And for the 30 years I was involved in it, this is by far the biggest change that I've ever seen, and the biggest pace of change, the fastest pace of change that I've ever seen. In the petrochemicals industry, there are two major advantages. In addition to the low-cost energy that the abundant gas now provides, pulling the gas out of the ground also pulls out an awful lot of natural gas liquids. And the ethane, propane, butane, natural gas liquids that come out with the gas, they have to be removed from the gas to get the specs correct on the gas. And those are the precursors or the feedstocks for the petrochemical industry. So not only is that industry benefiting from the low-cost energy, it's also benefiting from the massive increase in availability of feedstocks. And as a result of that, and I think, Paul, you showed some of those specifics as well on the different companies that are getting involved, but across the industry, there's a huge increase in fractionation plant growth and capacity growth. You're looking at a 40% increase in that area. In the ethylene cracker industry, you're looking at a 1/3 increase between now and 2016, 2017, where all the crackers come up. That's a very, very large industry, and for that industry to grow at 1/3 is just an incredible number, so it's really mind-boggling. If you look at the Texas petrochemical industry, we're looking at $8.5 billion of new capital spending in just this one state, and that's going to return $37 billion a year in new revenue. So again, even down to the local level, this is a major, major evolution for the industry. A lot of this was already touched on. This is all EIA data, so I won't go into it in too much detail, but just if I can sort of re-emphasize the one point. Oops. Okay. See if I can fix that. Okay. Okay, on the presentation. So where's the pointer?
I think that's the pointer.
This thing here?
Yeah. I'm not sure. Well,
Yeah, pointer. Okay. So if we look at natural gas production forecasting according to EIA, and I had this a second ago. There it is.
That might get lost in the screen.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it in the screen. Can y'all see that? Okay, we're not going to point today. The lower left-hand side graph has the forecast through 2035 for natural gas production globally. And these are EIA estimates, but I took the numbers and kind of consolidated them according to region to show the difference between the Gulf Coast, Russia and the U.S. In growth patterns, and then the rest of Europe in a non-growth pattern. In fact, European production represents in this time around 16% of total, and that, according to this estimate, that production total will go down to 9% over that time period. So what are the differences, and why are we talking about an evolution or a revolution here in the U.S. and talking about something else in Europe? I think the first speaker made a good series of points about why there are so many differences between the U.S. and Texas and Europe and France, and this is sort of a follow-up to some of those comments. Basically, I agree with everything he said. There is a coal, I'm calling it a coal bias in the U.S. Basically, the fact that we are substituting coal with the additional low-cost natural gas, it gives politicians political cover to make those decisions, to allow the regulations to evolve as they're evolving. And especially with a Democratic administration, they have the ability to do that because they can use the argument that it is a significant reduction in carbon emissions. So it is a good step in the right direction as an intermediate solution at the very least. So political cover. The infrastructure in Europe, it's been in place for a long time, and it's certainly in place now to import products into the countries that need it. So you've got LNG, Paul talked about that, and you've got massive pipeline infrastructure that brings the natural gas from the producing countries to the consuming countries. And that's been in place, and it'll stay in place. The fact that mineral rights in the U.S. are generally privately held, and they're generally publicly held in other parts of the world, that's going to make a big difference in the medium term and the long term. The differences in the approach of the precautionary principle is also a big difference. In France, for example, this year, several permits were pulled because the companies that held those permits were not willing to commit to using non-fracking processes to open up the shale. The technology is just not there to do it any other way, so they couldn't commit to doing any further developments there. So that's going to put them back for a period of time until hopefully the new technologies come along to allow them to open up in a different way according to what their needs And then lastly, and I'll end on this point, the infrastructure differences between the U.S. and other parts of the world are vastly different as well. The natural gas distribution and gas gathering pipeline networks in the U.S. are just fantastic, already in place, already ready to roll. You can hook up all those new fractionation plants fairly quickly. You can go out and drill more wells. You can ramp those well count numbers up and down pretty quickly. And then you're seeing this kind of development at this rapid pace because of that infrastructure that's already in place. So with that, I'll end. Thanks.
So my name's Rod Nelson. I had some really cool slides to show you, but we won't show. So what I'm going to do is I will try to explain to you a bit about how shale gas has been produced in the U.S. in the last 10 years, what's kind of fueled some of this renaissance that people have already talked about. And then I will try to give you some insight as to where the technology is going, so you have a sense for what we might do in the future. So as most of you probably already know, the two things that sort of combine to make the shale gas plays in the U.S. economic were a combination of horizontal drilling, where we actually drill the wells horizontally rather than vertically, which is how we historically drilled wells. And then we break the rock frequently as we come back from the very end of the well back towards the heel of the well with basically water, right? We pressurize the rock with an incompressible fluid like water, which is the cheapest thing we can find, and we break the rock, okay? That allows the gas to come out of the rock because these rocks are very tight, very hard. The gas can't flow very far, okay? So the more you break the rock, typically, the more you can produce. And what's happened over the last 10 years is that the industry has shifted almost entirely from vertical drilling to horizontal drilling and these multiple hydraulic fractures. And the number of fractures we create in each individual wellbore has gone up with time. And it's very common to say, you know, hydraulic fracturing is a very old technique. It's 50 or 60 years old. It's very true. But the fact is we're doing it differently than we did it 50 years ago. We're doing it many more times and on a much bigger scale, okay? And hydraulic fracturing itself, I will talk about it a little bit just so you get a sense for what it really is. It's a pretty simple process, basically, right? We are just basically failing the rock under tension, right? And then once we create that crack in the rock, which is actually quite small, quite narrow, and goes a few hundred feet typically away from the hole itself, then we have to hold that crack open somehow, because once we let the water pressure back out, the rock will want to close back up. So we put sand in that crack to hold it open, basically, right? But that creates a more permeable path for the gas to flow back out. Now, and this gets to sort of, I'll take you now through what some of the things that we're doing to try to address some of the concerns and try to reduce the number of resources that are being used today to create these hydraulic fractures. So the first one is, step number one, if we're going to do a better job of developing these resources, is making sure we place the wellbore in exactly the right place. So if you look historically as how these shale gas plays have been developed, because operators might lease a certain amount of acreage, and then they'll put as many wells in that acreage as they can fit, basically, and then drill as many holes as they can and as long as they can so that they exploit the most resource they think they can get. The problem with that technique is that the earth isn't homogeneous, as we all sort of know. But that was an easy way to do it in the beginning, right? And it kind of worked. You've seen the numbers. It works. We can produce more gas that way. But ultimately, we think, you know, where the industry has to go is you have to drill the well in exactly the right place, only drill wells in the most economic places, because many of the wells drilled today aren't economic. They get kind of covered up in the statistics, but many of them aren't actually economic. If we put the wells in exactly the right place, and then put the fractures in exactly the right place, rather than just do it every statistically some distance back from the center of the hole, we can produce better wells and use less resources, and in some cases dramatically less resources compared to doing it the other way. That's step number one. So that involves gathering the right kind of information, characterizing the rock before you drill, drilling the well with directional tools to allow you to control exactly where the hole goes, et cetera. And that's available today. The second step is the fracturing process itself. We introduced about a year ago something called highway. And in the first 50 years of hydraulic fracturing, as I mentioned, the way fracturing was done was pretty simple: water and sand. And you filled the entire crack with sand. But if you think about it, a better way to do it, because we're actually trying to flow the gas through that sand pack back out, would be to actually not fill that crack with sand, entirely with sand, but prop it open somehow and allow the gas to flow through the open crack. That would be almost infinite permeability, right? And so this highway technique actually allows you to do that. We pump basically, if you think of a coal mine, basically how it holds the seam open, pillars periodically. That's how we do highway. We pump clumps of sand that are held together by fibers that basically create pillars or pathways down there that aren't continuous, that hold the crack open yet allow the gas to flow back out. And that does really nicely a couple things. One, the wells produce more. We use less water and sand. And actually, if you think about it, one of the biggest environmental impacts of a whole hydraulic fracturing campaign are the truck traffic and the diesel engines that are out there to create this horsepower to break the rock. And if we use 30% less sand and less water, we use 30% less truck traffic and 30% less diesel time. And I had a slide that kind of showed you cumulatively how much we've saved so far, but a lot of diesel fuel, a lot of carbon emissions, a lot of water, a lot of sand, while the wells produce actually more. In some cases, 70, 80% more, using 30, 40% less raw materials. So that's a good step. And then the next step is modeling, understanding where the crack actually goes. We can today monitor. Ernie mentioned microseismic techniques. We can in real time today monitor where the crack is going by listening for as the rock breaks. We can triangulate where that happened in the earth. And we can actually control things in real time now. We can model where that crack is going, start and stop the process where we want to. And then finally, the next step would be to try to make sure that we use as little truck traffic and diesel engines as we possibly can. And so we have introduced some combination natural gas diesel engines. We've put into place some electric engines where we can get access to a grid. And so you will reduce the amount of emissions during the process. And then finally, on water itself, obviously the industry has taken quite a few steps. There's further to go, but we've taken quite a few steps towards recycling all the water. Obviously, all the water we pump into the ground to create the hydraulic fracture doesn't all come back. Certain percentages come back. Depends on the kind of rock and where we are, how dry the rock is. Some of that water comes back. We recycle that water today. We have to supplement the next fracture job with more fresh water, but obviously we've changed our chemistry so that we can use more brackish, salty water rather than fresh water each time, so we can better use the recycled water. And then a couple comments on, I had a slide that kind of showed you the state of play with disclosure. One of the big talking points, at least early on in the process about hydraulic fracturing, was disclosure. Will you tell us what chemistry is in the fluid? Well, we can. It's not, honestly, all that complicated. It's mostly water. The two other main components we have to add to the water is a biocide, because the water often comes from surface water collection or some other source. It might have bacteria in it. We don't want to introduce bacteria into the subsurface because it's nice and warm down there and a nice place for bacteria to grow. So we put a biocide. A biocide obviously is not a nice chemical, right? We're trying to kill something. So we have developed a technique that uses salt and electricity to create oxidizers that will kill the bacteria. If you've ever been around a saltwater swimming pool, it's the same process, right? You put in salt and electricity and you create chlorine ions, and you can kill bacteria that way. And so we're using that same technique now to reduce the biocides. The other main chemistry that's put into hydraulic fracture fluid is some kind of soap or surfactant to make, because we're pushing this fluid at a high rate down a pipe, there's a lot of friction. The less friction you have, the less horsepower you have to have at the surface to push that water down the pipe. And so we put in typically some kind of soap or something like that to make the water more slippery so it goes down the pipe faster. And those are the two major components. So today, many states require full disclosure. We can comply with that. There's no state regulation or federal regulation that we can't comply with today. We have a product you can look on our website or other places and find more information about. It's called OpenFrac. It's fully disclosed fracturing fluid. It gives you everything that's in it, adds up to 100%. There are still some proprietary stuff we get from suppliers, but a customer may or may not choose to use them. So the last thing I would just say is, to try to summarize, is, I know it's difficult with some graphics to try to picture some of this stuff, but I think one thing to keep in your mind is we are moving from sort of a statistical model to a optimized, more efficient model on how we develop these resources by drilling fewer wells, drilling them from well pads, drilling better wells, and fracturing only in the right places. We are moving towards reducing the total environmental footprint we have when we do this operation. Okay, thank you.
Philippe?
Thank you. Which one is the mouse? Okay. Well, good morning. My name is JP Nicot. I'm a research scientist here at the University of Texas at the Bureau of Economic Geology. And my area of expertise is water resources. And I've been working in the intersection between water resources and fracking for about, I guess, 6 years right now. So during that period of time, I've compiled a lot of data, and sometimes hard to get, actually. And I've prepared several reports for the state of Texas about the amount of water used by the industry for hydraulic fracturing and other oil and gas uses. So I'm going to present a few of those results, kind of put numbers on what everything has been said today. So here is a map just showing the state of the water use for fracking at 2 different times, and at the end of 2011 and 3 years earlier. So you could see that the spreading of the activity across the state during that period, and you can also see the numbers that change, going for 36,000 acre-feet and to 81,000 acre-feet, more than double. So if you're not familiar with that unit, acre-feet, an acre-feet is about 300,000 gallons. Or another way to put it is a little bit less than 1 million cubic meter. 1,000 acre-feet is a little bit less than 1 million cubic meter. I'd like also to point out that we talk a lot about shale gas, but actually it turns out that in Texas, hydraulic fracturing is used for many other things than shale gas, also for shale oil on what we call tight gas and tight oil. And the difference between the tight formation and the shale formations is that the shale formation is the source of the oil, the mudstone where the organic matter accumulated and generated the oil and gas. So that's right now, that's what the industry is going, is going after the source. But a tide formation is a conventional reservoir, if you want, which has become unconventional because of its very low permeability. So to extract the gas, you have to frack it. And in some place, in some areas, you know, those two types of accumulation are kind of intermingled. You just basically frack the whole section, like in the Permian Basin. So I've put a lot of names in there. You may recognize some of them, and some of them are kind of new, like the Klein Shale, like people are starting to talk about in West Texas. Others, like the Haynesville Shale, are kind of drop out of the picture a little bit because it's very deep and very expensive to produce from it. If we go back to those numbers in terms of water use, you know, how much is that? So, for instance, the city of Austin uses about 150,000 acre-feet. That means, you know, twice as much as the whole industry uses for the state of Texas in 2011. So, and the city of Dallas is almost 500,000 acre-feet. So you can say, well, that's not a lot. So, yeah, but you can also put it the other way. You say a family of 4 would use about, you know, 1 acre-feet a year. So, well, actually, that's a lot of water being used by the industry. So depending how you want to spin the story, can be a lot or not a lot. So let me show here also a bar plot showing the evolution of water use through different plays in Texas. So the Barnett Shale constant. So here I show 3 different years, 2011, 2010, and 2008. And you can see the tremendous growth of the Eagle Ford Shale because of the oil, actually, not the gas, but also of the Permian Basin and the relative steady state of the Barnett Shale. So I like to put that water use in context. So here is the total water use for the state of Texas. You know, a typical number for the state of Texas across the years, it depends a bit about the weather because a lot of water is used for irrigation. So if it's a dry or wet year, you know, those numbers vary. But a good number is about 15,000 or 15 million acre-feet. And so here the numbers is 15,000 to be compared to 80 that we know for the shale gas. So again, it's a lot and it's not a lot because if you happen to have your well next to a domestic well next to a well feeding the industry, you may be out of luck. And I may say a few more words about that later in discussion. Again, you know, I wanted also to compare the water use for the oil and gas industry to the other mining industry, like the production of aggregates, production of crushed stones, you know, to make concrete and to build roads. So it's about the same order of magnitude, you know. And here I'm talking about consumption, not the amount of water, because those industries do a lot of recycling as well. So it's in the ballpark of what other industries, mining industries, use. So a big problem, if you want to understand the impact of fracking, you need to get the right data. And actually, if you can come up with some idea of the total volume, it's extremely hard to know the source. You can ask a company, you can ask 2 companies, you can ask 5 companies. There are hundreds of companies doing hydraulic fracturing across the state. So a few companies are not necessarily representative of the full picture. So I was able to get information for about 30% of the total water use in the state. And when I look at the information, starting with the Barnett Shale about 5 years ago, at the time, about 60% of the water used in the play was from groundwater. And right now, in the Barnett Shale, there is kind of a reversal of the use. Now it's mostly surface water being used. probably because that's kind of mature play now, and all the water lines have been put in place, and so they can rely on surface water, which is typically, in places. You have a big lake, a big water body, you have a river, as opposed to groundwater. You drill a well anywhere, you get groundwater. So that's the first approach. You just hit groundwater because it's just easier to do it that way. And if you look at that map again, you see as you go west, you use more and more groundwater. That makes sense, because as you go west in Texas, it becomes drier. Okay. And the previous speaker mentioned something about recycling. So here are some numbers about recycling in Texas. There is very, very little recycling going on overall in the state. And that's because it's still, it makes more economic sense to pump, new water, if you want, and to dispose of the wastewater, as opposed to some other place like in the Marcellus in the northeast, where there is relatively few injection wells. So it makes more sense to recycle it. But something that I noticed in the past few years too, that the industry is making use a lot more of brackish water than they did in the past, especially again in the Permian Basin. And that may be because there is not much fresh water over there. So if they want to use water, they have to tap the brackish water, aquifers in particular. And there is little reuse too for another reason. I mentioned the economic aspect of it, but the second reason is what we call the flowback water, the amount of water coming back from fracking. So especially in a shale, which is full of gas, which is dry. So if you inject water, the shale is going to suck all the water and keep it. And so you end up with flowback of, let's say in Haynesville, 15%, Eagle Ford 20%. So that's the maximum you can come back with. So if you want to frack another well nearby, you need to provide, even if you recycle that 20% coming back, you still need to provide the 80%. That's at the end of year one. Typically in the shale, it comes back fairly quickly. So, and I'd like to conclude, let me skip that slide. To conclude with this one, it's just a slide. I was surfing the web this morning, and I realized that very nice map showing the Eagle Ford that you can see in here. Here is a map like from a few years ago showing all those the cities. So at nighttime, the Houston in here, San Antonio here and here, the valley area in here, Laredo, and the Eagle Ford here, it's totally black. There is basically nobody living there, very low density. And now, with all the rigs, all the activity, it's almost as bright as Houston in a very large area. So I think that was a wonderful way of showing, the increase of activity in the area. So with this, I'll conclude my.
The Honorable Mark Strama.
Good morning. Mike mentioned that he was glad he spoke third so that he didn't have to repeat things that everyone else had already said. I'm glad I spoke last so that I know what the hell I'm talking about now. One of the entertaining experiences we Texans have had in the past year was that our governor ran for president. And the predicate of his campaign for president was that the state of Texas had created more jobs in the last few years than any other state in the country. In fact, in one particular year, the state of Texas created more jobs than every other state in the country combined, which is a remarkable statistic, a jaw-dropping statistic. And of course, the governor would have us all believe that it's because he was governor, because of his policies on taxes, on the environment, or in that case, his lack of policies on the environment, on torts. But if you look at the history of the economy of Texas, it fluctuates over time, not based on our tax policy, our environmental policy, our tort policy, nor the wisdom of our governors, nor the genius of our legislators. The variable that most closely correlates the ups and downs in the Texas economy over time is the price of oil. And in the year in which Texas created more jobs than every other state in the country combined, oil reached $146 a barrel. Now, $4 a gallon gas was brutal for the national economy, brutal for consumers even in Texas. But $146 a barrel oil was pretty good for the state of Texas economy. And since that time, I have been predicting, starting 5 years ago, that the confluence of $4 a gallon gasoline and an unpopular war in the Middle East that had something, if not everything, to do with oil, and a hurricane that nearly wiped out the city of New Orleans, which may have had nothing to do with global warming, but it gave Americans a material, consequential way of understanding the risk of cataclysmic climate change. That those things happening all at the same time would lead us on an inexorable path toward new energy technologies that threatened this state's primacy in the global energy economy. And that's significant because 15% of this state's GDP comes from energy, and almost all of it is oil and gas. And it's not just that segment of our economy that benefits. Anybody who remembers what $12 a gallon oil felt like in Texas, it affected every industry in this state. It affected the entire economy. And so I think we as a state need to be extremely concerned about what the future evolution of the energy marketplace looks like in order to protect our primacy in it. And at that time I said, we need to be leaders in the evolution toward renewable energy. And that some disruptive technology could genuinely threaten our leadership. Now, it turns out a disruptive technology has come along and fundamentally changed the marketplace. It just wasn't in the area of renewables. It was hydraulic fracturing. And it is, and fortunately for Texas, that plays right into our wheelhouse. And so I think it's important that we think about what it means for natural gas to be a bridge to a clean energy future. Now, I mentioned that I thought the consumerate in America had really changed when we had those three things happen at the same time. But then a fourth thing happened, the biggest economic contraction since the 1930s. And it's amazing to look at public polling data about whether or not we as a people believe humans cause climate change. Because when those three things happened together, we did. And when the economy contracted and we would have to pay the price to do something about it, suddenly we didn't. Our belief in the scientific question of whether humans cause climate change changed dramatically when our economic circumstances changed. And suddenly, any intention on the part of the newly elected Obama administration to do something about it dissipated and was lost to the cause of trying to create economic recovery. And yet, as Dr. Moniz pointed out in that first slide, without any policy to facilitate it, there has been a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions from our energy generation because we've had we went from 1/2 to 1/3 of coal as the mix in generating electricity. And that's a direct function of hydraulic fracturing and natural gas, which is why Dr. Moniz is right when he says there's not many American politicians who are going to object to it, which means we have to make sure that, as he said, we manage it well, because the fact that it's manageable doesn't mean we'll manage it well. It's noteworthy that Texas was one of the first states to adopt a disclosure bill requiring that people be able to see what chemicals are being used. And I was proud to be a joint author, but the leadership on that came from House Energy Resources Committee Chairman Jim Keffer. And I think we're going to have to, if we want to save the goose that's laying the golden egg for us right now, we're going to have to continue to get better about the other ecological footprints that fracturing has. we're going to have to reduce the strain on the transportation infrastructure. We are going to have to use more recycled water. We are going to have to make sure we're sensitive to the seismic implications of where we do fracturing. And government and public policy has a role to play in each of those areas. But I hope we also give thought to what it really means for this to be a bridge, because people use that phrase in a way that often I find there's not a whole lot of policy behind it or vision of how it serves that role. Because it is true that at the same time natural gas is displacing coal, it's making it really hard for solar and wind. My legislative director joked to me the other day when I missed a meeting with some solar folks that he attended for me. I said, well, what's the short story? He said, well, the short story is, they're 3 years from grid parity, which was the short story 3 years ago and 3 years before that. But it's not because solar hasn't achieved some dramatic efficiencies and reductions in price. They've come down something like 70% over the last 2 years. It's that the bogey they have to hit to reach grid parity has gotten a lot harder because of the effect of natural gas in the electricity marketplace. And so the question is, what does it mean for natural gas to be a bridge when what natural gas is really doing is making it much harder for solar and wind to compete? My view of that is that what natural gas has also done is bought us some capacity to invest in the electric marketplace by reducing, in a very material way, the cost of electricity to ratepayers and reestablishing American competitiveness in manufacturing and all the salutary things that go with it. It has also enabled us to find the resources to invest in renewable energy R&D. And I had a very interesting conversation before this panel with Dr. Moniz about what led to the emergence of hydraulic fracturing. And it wasn't just unfettered free markets. It was a lot of strategic intervention in the marketplace, from the Gas Resources Institute, from a public policy that gave a generous tax credit. I think my rough calculations in the hall were that probably at a slightly larger scale than the investment tax credit and the production tax credit for solar and wind. And it had going for it, at the time that it really hit the marketplace, a very high price. And so that gives us some insight as to where we need to go if we want to be positioned for a 50-year horizon that includes cleaner energy even than natural gas. And the last thing I would say about that is that we are up against a fiscal cliff at the federal level, where I do not participate. I'm a member of the state legislature. But it does seem to me that the fact pattern I've just laid out suggests that when we're trying to reduce the deficit, one of the smartest things we should be talking about right now is a carbon tax. In a sort of a politically suicidal instinct similar to Mitt Romney's, I have an urge to write an op-ed titled Tax Texas. But it's not quite as crazy as letting Detroit go bankrupt, because the reason Texas would be the principal taxpayer under a carbon tax is because it would drive economic activity into our state, away from the coal producers. It would increase the use of natural gas. It would increase the GDP of this state because it would shift even more than the market already has the electricity marketplace away from coal and toward natural gas. It would be a win for Texas. And yes, we'd be the biggest taxpayer under a carbon tax. We'd also be the biggest economic grower. And so those are my thoughts, and I appreciate the opportunity to share them with you.
That offered a lot of red meat for discussion. I must say I personally had not connected that the simple transposition of vowels took Texas to taxes. But anyway, I think, well, we have about 25 minutes. I'm recovering some of the late time that we had for questions. I'm going to try to fire a few questions down at the panel and ask for very quick answers, and then open it up to the floor. Paul, I'm going to start with you. You talked a lot about LNG. And there's this question of whether a global market actually develops presumably that needs LNG to be contracted in different ways, to have more of a spot market, et cetera. What do you think about that prospect?
It's difficult to have a global market because of the amount of investment of billions of dollars, so you end up with a 20 or 30-year deal when you build one of these projects, and so someone's off-taking for 20, 30 years. So spot pricing has increased, but it's not a significant part of the market right now. Interestingly enough, if you look at the facilities that have applied for DOE permits to export LNG, the primary offtake of those facilities are Japanese trading companies, and obviously they're trying to impact the global price of LNG going into Asia, and by creating as much supply as possible. So that's the brief answer. I don't know, and those are some of the factors. So.
It does have huge implications. As I said earlier, there are also geopolitical issues. It's a good segue to a question to Mike, because Japan clearly wants this gas from the United States also to, frankly, try to break some of its indexing to oil. Mike, the petrochemical companies, however, have, some of them at least, have been pretty outspoken trying to prevent exports. What's your take on that?
You know, they definitely have a bias against export. When I say they, I mean the ones that have spoken out have a bias against export because of the concern of driving the gas price back to $6 or even higher. And I really can't say if that's a legitimate position or self-serving position or something in between, but that's definitely a position based on the potential for upward cost.
From what I've heard you and others say, why don't we produce wet gas, ship out the dry gas, and give you the ethane?
Well, absolutely.
And propane, et cetera.
But the industry is still energy intensive, so if you're driving the industry would be benefiting from the lower cost gas as well as the NGLs. And if gas prices go past $6 into that $8, $9 range because LNG is taking off in a big way and find some parity with the global markets, then some of that competitive advantage will be given up domestically. Some of it, but not all of it.
Can I ask a question about this?
Of course.
What's the amortization period for the investment you have to make in exporting, in developing the infrastructure to export natural gas? Because when I look at those maps that show the resources in other parts of the world, I don't assume that they're never going to figure out how to develop them, and I figure you guys as companies are going to go and help them figure out how to develop them, and that's a big economic opportunity. So how long do you have to see this big gap in the price domestically and the price internationally for you to justify the investment in the infrastructure to export?
It's a 20 to 30-year investment is what it is, and the Japanese will sign an offtake agreement to the facilities in the Gulf Coast for somewhere between 20 and 30 years, maybe 20 with some renewables on it, something of that nature. I think what you're trying to see is and for everybody's clarification, in the United States, we price natural gas off a Henry Hub, which is traded in Louisiana, and it's $1 per million BTU. The rest of the world prices natural gas off of the energy equivalent of oil, which makes it that much more expensive. And the Japanese are trying to buy at Henry Hub Index Plus and get off the oil standard. That's what they're trying to do with buying.
But they're willing to commit now to 20 and 30-year off-taking contracts?
Absolutely, yes.
So it may be their judgment that would be in question if they don't think that huge reserve closer to them.
What they're saying is, I like the pricing in the United States. I will pay the Henry Hub plus the cost of the facility, plus the cost of shipping, and still feel it's a good deal against a oil index price in Japan.
But isn't the reason we're not an oil indexed price just because our supply surged so dramatically in the last 5 years, right? I mean, I've always heard that the two prices rose and fell largely in tandem until fracking created a big difference in supply here. Is that, and so it may, I mean, why wouldn't a surge in supply over there from accessing all those resources that were shown on the map cause the price of natural gas there to deviate from the price of oil?
It will over time, and the findings in East Africa and Australia. It will over time. It's just that these are 20-year projects, so the timeline is not 1 year or 2 years. It'll take longer.
Maybe it's worth also adding, well, first of all, as was said earlier, but just to reinforce, the United States is the only place where essentially it's gas-on-gas pricing, and that's for a lot of reasons, including the fact that we have the infrastructure, the pipeline that somebody showed, the pipeline infrastructure to move gas to markets, et cetera. But I do want to emphasize that we've been focusing on LNG here, but of course, a lot of supply internationally is from long pipelines, but it has the same issue. You build a few thousand-mile pipeline, and it's a huge capital cost. In that case, it only goes from point A to point B, and so these long-term contract structures are in place. I do want to say one thing, however. The index to oil is not everywhere to oil on an energy basis. That's really like in Japan, which is why they're paying $16 or something. There are also indexing, like in Europe, often to oil products, and they're paying this intermediate price, $10, $11, let's say, typically. That's why if a global market would change dynamics greatly, but I would reinforce Paul's point. I think it's easy to know what that market would look like, but it's hard to know how you ever get there from here with all the contracts. So it's going to be very, 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 very interesting. Just to move on to Rod, going back to the environmental issues, and it's certainly impressive, a lot of the work being done to minimize the environmental footprint. On the other hand, I would have to say that the natural gas industry, and I recognize using those words is already rising to a very high level of abstraction, but the natural gas industry, in my view, has not exactly been very forward-leaning in terms of coming together in ways that propagate best practices by everyone so that, in fact, these manageable problems are managed by everyone. Water issues, there have been water issues, not from fracking, but from bad well completion. There have been surface water spills. There clearly has been methane leakage, et cetera. So I'm sure you're going to volunteer to lead the industry into more best practices.
Well, I mean, I think it's a fair point, first of all. But as you said, you know, the natural gas industry is not terribly well defined or organized. There are a lot of constituents in there, and quite frankly, you know, some of the organizations that moved in and started to develop early some of the resources like the Marcellus are very small regional players who don't subscribe to more regulation or organizing themselves around an industry institute or something like that. They don't do that. And so all we can do is participate in those groups that are willing to have constructive dialogue. We've tried to do that, and we try to demonstrate some of these things are possible, like full disclosure, like operational integrity, those kinds of things, which I didn't have time to talk about, or better cementing techniques. We have built cements that are flexible. One of the problems with cement is it's just like in your driveway, it can crack, right? It's a pretty rigid material. If you put certain additives into cement, you can make it more flexible so that it lasts a much longer time and doesn't create cracks that can potentially cause flow up outside the pipe. That stuff's available. Is it used all the time? No, quite frankly, it's not, because it costs a bit more. So, yeah, we're trying to lead, but there's a lot of competition out there amongst the different players that are in the industry, and it's not as cohesive as it should be, quite honestly.
I'll just end by saying that, however, with the big players moving in, both oil companies and service companies,
Correct.
You would think a coalition of the willing could be a bit more forward-leaning than we've seen. JP, on water, why aren't we seeing, of course, Texas is its own universe by itself, but if I include other parts of the country where shales are, crossing a number of state lines, et cetera, why aren't we seeing integrated water management plans for a whole water basin, for all the uses that you put up there,
Well,
which would reinforce the points that you've made about the competition?
Well, I believe for the same reason that Rod mentioned, that there's a lot of players, a lot of competition. So they are management plan. They are trying to, each individual company is trying to optimize, their own operations, for sure, and minimize the water use, because after all, water is heavy and it costs to transport it, to truck it or pipeline. So the industry's interest is also to minimize the use. But I believe the reason is that the competition between operators, so it doesn't make sense for them to come together. And although they do, I believe, from time to time, but there is not a large consortium that would optimize. I think they would need some kind of incentive, from the state or from federal government to do that.
Can I make, I think maybe valid to this, the construct of this organization or this meeting. I've had some meetings with some of the folks from the EU and other countries. The fact of the matter is that the way the U.S. ownership of mineral rights and size of land plots make it very difficult, as JP mentions. In Europe, it's a different story, right? The mineral rights ownership are across at the state level, and therefore you can, from a regulatory point of view, force operations to be much more integrated, if you like, and much more, therefore more efficient.
If you wish to be in office a short time. Mark, you made lots of interesting comments. Let me just pick up on your last one, which I think is very interesting, and maybe I'll make a proposal, which actually is contained in a 2010 report of the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. You said that the lowered consumer prices should provide some room for extra funding for innovation so that we don't have a bridge to nowhere. So why don't we, let's say, have one, and the GRI funding that we discussed earlier was analogous to that. Yes. It was a small charge on moving energy. So why don't we in Texas or in the country have a, let's say, 1 mil per kilowatt hour, that's $4 billion a year for innovation.
I'm for it.
Are you going to do it?
I mean, look, here's how for it I am. I filed a bill 3 or 4 years ago that, in the spirit of many of my bills, never saw the light of day. But here was my proposal. This university, the University of Texas, is funded in very large part by revenues from oil and gas. And when oil was over $100 a barrel, it was a huge windfall to the Permanent University Fund that funds this and other universities in Texas. So I actually filed a bill that said whenever oil goes over 100, which wasn't in the forecast, it's found money, it wasn't in the budget, that we have to take the revenues that come in from the surplus above 100 and dedicate it to renewable energy-related R&D at these universities. When you walk to a football game from 19th Street, which we're right in front of, you walk right in front of Santa Rita Oil Rig number 2. And that is a testament to what an important role the energy industry has played here. And this university, as a result, is, for anybody who wants to have a career in energy, this is probably one of the best places in the world to go to school, with all due respect to MIT. And
Have you ever been to Cambridge?
I have, actually. It was really freaking cold. I would love to see this university be as much of a leader in the disciplines that are going to produce the leaders in the renewable energy sector as it is and has been in the traditional energy sector. So I think the federal government ought to do that. Right now, we really do have found money in our pockets from the explosion of this industry, and it's doing much more good than harm. But it isn't a bridge unless we're strategic about it.
Great. Well, we have about 10 minutes to still open it up now for questions. We have one over here. Please just say briefly who you are and to whom you are addressing the question. And then we'll come here. Great. Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, Mark, thanks for the question. It's a good one. It's also a little bit beyond my area of study in the past, but essentially diesel is something that's coming in greater ratios from the refineries today in America because the refineries spent tens of billions of dollars over the last 10 or 15 years basically reconfiguring their facilities to produce more diesel and less gasoline because that's where the financial incentives were. So it's always going to be a question of, what the affordability is of doing one thing versus another thing. So if you have a technology that you're developing or that you have to convert gas to liquids, which is something that is seeing the light of day today, it has to go against the existing technologies and the existing infrastructure. So I think the answer is sort of a question, what are the economics of those two paths, and can a synthetic diesel compete head-to-head with a traditional diesel? We're seeing some synthetic diesels that are popular because of what they are, but from an economy standpoint, are they sustainable enough to make a big impact? It's hard to say right now.
But just to add, I mean, this issue of how you monetize the gas is, there are options, as you point out. Sasol is talking about a possible big GTL plant here in the Gulf. In the Mideast and Qatar, there's huge plants. Also, there are discussions not only about diesel, but, for example, reviving ideas like methanol, for example, to be used as a fuel. China is actually advancing that. So I think those monetization decisions tend to be specific to various markets. Actually, Trinidad is, again, another place that exports gas. It also exports product, ammonia. Here, and then here, and then there, and then there. And brief questions, and questions end with a question mark. Right. Well, okay, go ahead.
Well, I'll just say, first of all, thanks for your offer of help on the carbon tax. You and me together, we'll kill it. I've actually asked a bunch of people in Washington what would make it happen, and they said the only thing that'll make it happen is if on December 29th, when they're facing the threat of the fiscal cliff, you know, they're $500 billion apart, which is about the amount of money you get over 10 years from a reasonably priced carbon tax, and it's the least painful option on the table, and it's not coming from environmentalists, right? It's coming from, it's a fiscal initiative. With regard to I'm somewhat amazed, frankly, that with the price of natural gas where it is today and where it seems to be projected for the medium to long term, that there isn't a more aggressive move in the transportation sector toward compressed natural gas as a vehicle fuel. I worked with the American Natural Gas Association last legislative session, and we passed legislation to subsidize the creation of natural gas refueling stations for heavy vehicles in the corridor between Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas. And that, you know, there's research that indicates that that has catalyzed some large, heavy fleets to convert to natural gas, or is in the process of catalyzing that conversion. I'd like to see, frankly, I'm more interested in that application of our abundant and cheap, clean resource natural gas than in exporting it. You know, I think we've got lots of opportunities to grow demand and grow the market here before we make huge investments in 20-year capital investments to ship our resources elsewhere.
I would just add to that. First of all, we have to distinguish, of course, very sharply between compressed natural gas and liquefied natural gas. CNG is a major fuel in many parts of the world. The United States is well behind. We have inexplicable high costs, for example, for converting light-duty vehicles, completely out of whack with everybody else. We, until now, because of peculiarities of our energy efficiency laws, have not had biofuel gas, petroleum vehicles like other parts of the world, including Europe. That's getting cleaned up now in the new policies. With regard to and the fleets, delivery trucks that live in cities are converting to compressed natural gas very, very rapidly. On liquefied natural gas, Mark, I agree with Mark that probably the only real market for that, for heavy trucks right now, is trucks that go back and forth, A to B to A to B to A to B, because the fueling infrastructure is a huge issue, and furthermore, a Class 8 truck has about a $70,000 price differential to a regular diesel truck, and you got to be pretty confident about your price differentials on fuels to make that up, number one. And number two, a less known fact is that a major part of the economics of a Class 8 truck is the aftermarket. Who do you sell it to after you've used it for some years, like, say, Thailand? They may be less interested in an LNG truck in the aftermarket. So there's a number of issues, but I do agree, nevertheless, that we will see opportunities. There was a question here in the front. Yes.
My question is to the producers, Mr. Cavicchi and Mr. Nelson, on regulation. What openness, if any, is there in the boardroom for the idea that regulation can actually help you by setting a floor so that, you know, the two-bit operators don't undercut you? You know, if you do a more expensive practice now, it's like unilateral disarmament. But if you have regulation, does that set a floor? Is that open for that or not?
So the question is the economic proposition of environmental regulation.
Yeah, so to answer your question specifically, in the boardroom of a company there, like ours, there is a discussion like that. Where that discussion gets difficult is when I have a discussion with my customer. They aren't too receptive to that notion, right? Because they're, you know, certain, you know, that'll raise the cost of their operation potentially, right? So, yeah, I mean, I think there. Now, having said that, you know, organizations like, you know, API, IPAA, you know, that have historically been very anti-regulation, as Ernie asked earlier. I mean, those organizations are coming around and understanding that, you know, the industry has to get ahead of this a little bit. We've been very slow, and I think there is some momentum towards accepting more regulation. Certainly at the state level. There's been a lot of support at the state level by lots of organizations to help states set the bar higher.
Okay, we're going to have time for maybe just like one more question. Okay, we have 3 questions. Get the questions up very shortly, all of you, and then some of them will get answered. This gentleman was first, then here, and then there. A very, very short question, please.
My question is directed towards Strama.
Could you speak up?
My question is directed towards Strama. As you said that, so I wanted to get clarified that you're saying that we ought to be the biggest carbon taxpayer, and if so, with the fact that I think that the gas investment opens up opportunities in the energy sector, investment of energy sector, how is that going to make ways for renewables?
Thank you. Next question, and then we're going to come back to all the answers.
John Olson from Petroleum Engineering here at UT. So the question is about the compatibility of price. You guys sound like you're talking about $3 gas into the long-term future, but I see numbers, operators saying they need $6.50 to be economic. How are those things compatible? We're cutting costs, trying to pay for better environmental protections that cost money.
Pricing structures. And there's a question here. Last question.
It's kind of a follow-on to the transportation sector and building infrastructure. Are we better off building infrastructure in the power grid to utilize the cheaper differential in price for natural gas, and then also allow for integration of renewables as opposed to investing in just natural gas infrastructure?
Great. So we have 3 questions on the table. You want to hit the first one, Mark?
Quick answer to the first one is I said Texas probably would be the highest payer of taxes under a carbon tax because we're the largest emitter of carbon. So if you tax emissions of carbon, we're going to be the biggest taxpayer. Interestingly, though, I think our emissions would grow, not reduce, under a carbon tax because of the amount of economic activity it would drive away from coal into natural gas. And so our tax burden would go up, but so would our GDP by a more than commensurate amount.
Second question was on natural gas pricing and how do you make money with today's prices?
I think somebody brought up earlier that Haynesville's deeper, a little harder to get to, and drier, much drier. They didn't say drier, but I'm saying drier. So the cost of producing in Haynesville is almost out of the money right now. Whereas you look at Eagle Ford and Utica and Marcellus and a lot of other places, there's enough NGL in the gas that you can actually produce the gas and not make any money at all on it. And you're making your money on the liquids. So that just kind of creates a scale rather than a single number, and but that people are living within that scale.
Yeah, and I would just add that, I mean, keep in mind that the cost of developing these resources tends to go down over time. You know, well, today it might take $6 to develop some of these resources. When we introduce some new technology like the highway I mentioned, you produce more at less cost, so it brings the economics down.
The last question dealt with kind of the trade-off, transportation, electricity infrastructure. Anybody want to grab that? All right. Okay, I will. Fine. First of all, let me just say you raised a very interesting point that was not raised today, and that is that another element that where we should not be looking at gas and renewables as being in competition is the role of gas in allowing large amounts of intermittent renewables to come into the grid and to be managed. It's complicated. It doesn't drive generation the same way it drives capacity, but I think that's a very important point until and if large-scale energy storage becomes a viable option. In terms of carbon effects, what you said is basically, I think, implied, I would also agree with, that today, if we are displacing coal, we get a bigger bang for the buck with methane in the electricity sector than we do in the transportation sector. CNG will have a modest CO2 benefit, but if you do any conversion, even to methanol, it's a wash on carbon. And so you have a bigger leverage right now, at least, if you have coal to displace in the power sector.
Does that become a little less true the bigger the truck? The heavier the fleet that you're converting to CNG,
No.
do you get a better bang for the buck? No.
Not really, no. And there are other issues in the LNG still, like boil off of the LNG, so it's, yeah. Well, okay, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. There are many other issues we could address, but I'd like to thank all the panelists for their contributions.